All righty, we'll get this going. Welcome everyone to the FAFSA Changes Highlight session with KASFAA. We are glad that you are all here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Please put all of your questions or comments in the chat. We'll gladly get to them at the end. And just a reminder to stay muted until the end of the presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three presenters. So we have Danielle Sullivan, Darcy Johnson, and Leah Nicholson joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited that so many of you have registered and logged in today for this important session on the 23-24 FAFSA. My name is Danielle Sullivan, and I am with Johnson County Community College in lovely Overland Park, Kansas. My co-presenters are Darcy Johnson from Washburn University and Leah Nicholson from the University of Kansas. And we thought the theme of Stranger Things was pretty apt for this year because we are truly living in the upside down. We're trying our best to kind of figure things out, and luckily we have a wonderful community, which includes all of you out there in the college access world to kind of bond together and figure out kind of what we're doing to best help our students in the upcoming year. So during this presentation, we are going to go over all of those changes to the 24-25 FAFSA. So that's going to include all of the new terminology, such as consent and role-based. Consent is key. We're going to learn that that is incredibly important for the FAFSA coming up. We're going to talk about the new FSA ID process, which is going to be called the studentaid.gov account, and Darcy's going to talk about that. We'll talk about the parents' role in the FAFSA process. We'll talk about unusual circumstances, changes to all of those specific questions, the new student aid index that's going to replace the EFC, and talk a little bit about how Pell is going to be calculated. And we're going to talk about, honestly, what we still don't know and kind of our recommendations for you moving forward. So let's kick it off. We're going to start by kind of comparing the differences between this current FAFSA that we're in and the future FAFSA. The biggest thing is that in the past, we're used to the FAFSA opening October 1st. And this year, for the only year, it's going to open mid to late December. If I had to place my bets, I'm going to guess December 31st at 11:59 p.m. that FAFSA is going to go live. So make sure you're telling your families and your students that this year's FAFSA is going to be a little bit different in that it's not going to open until December at some point. But moving forward, the 25-26 FAFSA, they've promised, will be back to the October 1st schedule. There were just a lot of upgrades, a lot of systems that had to be rebuilt in the FSA area. So they're kind of starting from scratch with all of these new systems. The other biggest change, which we can all cheer for, is that the federal student aid ID process is going to change, and it's going to allow parents without a social security number to actually set up the FSA ID, and it's going to turn into the studentaid.gov account. So they're going to phase out that terminology, and it'll be studentaid.gov account. And Darcy has a whole section on that, so she will talk about that in detail for you all. The other big change is that all contributors plus the student will need that FSA ID in order to provide their consent, because this FAFSA is role-based. So that is a big difference, and we'll go over that terminology. The other big change is that right now, the FSA ID is not required to start a FAFSA. So students can actually create their ID and start the FAFSA with no issues. But beginning with this next year, you have to have that FSA ID to start the FAFSA, because that is the way that you're going to provide consent. So that's going to impact your financial aid nights. You might have to have two nights, one where they set up, and then the other one where they actually go in and do the FAFSAs. And that could impact your messaging to where you might want to let them know to set up that ID prior to coming to your FAFSA help nights. Like I mentioned, there's brand new terminology such as role-based and consent, and we'll talk about that. The other big change is that either the student or the parent could really complete that entire FAFSA except the signature. So the parent could log in, do everything all up into the end, and then the student, all they would need to do is log in and complete the signature portion. That is actually changing. It's going to a role-based completion process, to where the student completes their own section, the parent completes their own section. Also, the IRS data retrieval tool is going away, and it's now going to be a direct data exchange with the IRS. So the minute that you provide your consent on the FAFSA, it automatically links with your IRS data if there is data within the IRS system. So you don't have to log in separately to get the IRS information to actually load on the FAFSA. It will be done automatically. Another thing we can cheer for is there are fewer questions. I believe it went from 100 and some questions down to 30, 40 questions. So there are far fewer questions on the FAFSA. There's also going to be a new status called provisional independent student, and that is where a student who may not be able to provide their parents' information on the FAFSA will be able to still submit the FAFSA and have an estimated student aid index calculated for them. That's a big change because right now the FAFSA goes into a rejected status and it does not calculate an EFC. So that's going to be something different. And we have a whole section on that as well. The asset questions have changed, and Darcy will cover what has changed with assets. You can also list up to 20 colleges, which is pretty sweet, instead of 10. The expected family contribution is morphing into the student aid index. So that is brand new. And then there's not going to be a signature page anymore because theoretically under this new process, everyone, even regardless of whether or not they have a social security number, will be able to set up that ID in order to log into the FAFSA. So there will not be a signature page option. And then super fun enrollment intensity. So now your Pell Grant will be affected by how many credit hours a student is enrolled in, and we'll have a whole section on that as well. So those are the big changes from 23-24 to 24-25. Next slide, please. So let's get into some of our new terminology. I put the important ones at the top, contributor and consent, because we're moving to a role-based completion process. So role-based, that means each contributor will need to complete their own section on the FAFSA. So that means the parent will need to complete their own section and the student needs to complete their own section, and neither the twain shall meet. So the student won't be able to do the parent section and the parent won't be able to do all of the student section. They still can do some of the student portion, but not the entire thing like they can now, except the signature. So every person needs to provide their consent, and the consent is what allows the IRS to match with the FAFSA to put that IRS information directly onto the application. You cannot get federal student aid without consent, and we have screenshots of the consent process, so we'll actually be able to show you what it's going to look like in the FAFSA. Again, no consent, no financial aid, so that's a big term for this year. And then a contributor is going to be any individual that's required to provide their consent and their tax information along with their signature. So a contributor could be the following. It's definitely going to be the student, but it could also be the student's spouse if they're married. It's going to be a biological or adoptive parent, or the parent's spouse, such as a step parent. And Darcy's going to go into who is my parent and who do I put on the FAFSA as my parent a little bit later. The other big one is that EFC, expected family contribution, is going away, and that's going to be replaced by the student aid index. So it's going to be able to be negative as well. So students can have a negative student aid index, and this will be what financial aid administrators are going to use to calculate a student's eligibility for Pell Grants, other types of grants, student loans. Provisional independent student is a new term as well, and this is for students who have unusual circumstances who may not be able to provide their parents' information on the FAFSA. It actually allows them to submit the FAFSA, and it doesn't go into that rejected status. They receive an estimated student aid index, and then schools are required to follow up. And again, we'll have a section on this to talk about what that kind of looks like and show you some cool screenshots too. FTI is new. That stands for Federal Tax Information. And that's going to be any information pulled directly from that IRS direct data exchange. So that information is going to be heavily protected to when the student actually submits their FAFSA, anything that was pulled over from the IRS will be masked and they will not be able to see it. because it was directly transferred from the IRS. So they won't be able to even see that information on their FAFSA submission summary. Only schools will receive that information, so students will not be able to view that. And that is a little bit of a change. Family size is going to replace the term household size. And then FAFSA submission summary replaces the student aid report. So that is a little bit different. And then unusual circumstances are those situations where a financial aid administrator may determine that a student is truly independent based on their circumstances. And then special circumstances are situations that impact a student's financial condition, such as loss of income. So it used to be these two were combined. Special circumstances encompassed all of those things. Now they've separated it out to distinguish between students who may not be able to provide their parents' information and then students whose financial situation no longer reflects what they've put on the FAFSA. So take a deep breath. I know we've got a lot of new terms. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is what the role-based process looks like within the FAFSA. The student's going to log in with their FSA ID or studentaid.gov account, and they're going to be asked to invite their contributors to their FAFSA. So this is where the student would need to provide their parents' information, such as their first and last name, date of birth, social security number. There is a box to check if the parent does not have a social security number. And then the email address is super important because it's going to send that invite to the email address that the student designates on the FAFSA. And that email is going to be sent to the parent. They will click a link and they will be able to log into their portion of the FAFSA to complete it. So role-based, that's going to be very important. The student will be inviting these contributors to be on their FAFSA. Next slide, please. This is what the consent process looks like. So it's a lot of legal language. A lot of this is not new. This was at the end of the FAFSA. So if you go to the very end where all the signatures are, a lot of this was in that section. So they've moved it to the front. So they have to read through all of these things. There's a FAQ section, and then there's a button at the bottom that says accept or decline. And if they click decline, a little bitty pop-up box that you see at the bottom right of the screen says either provide consent or decline, and it says the student will not be eligible for federal student aid. So not providing consent is not an option anymore. Next slide, please. So let's look at our cast of characters. So is the information that I need to complete the FAFSA changing? Not really. You're still going to need most of the information that you need now. So just like 11, the FSA ID is super important and you can't really start anything without her, right? So you can't start the FAFSA without that ID, which is going to move to studentaid.gov account. So that's the most important thing that contributors are going to need in order to complete the FAFSA. Then they're going to need tax returns as well. So in a perfect scenario, it will pull over most of that information from the IRS when you provide your consent, but you'll still probably need those to just as a reference point. And just like sometimes we have to go to the upside down to retrieve our tax returns. And sometimes what we bring in, isn't really what we were looking for in the first place. So we often have to go back to students and tell them this isn't the right tax return. We need something else, or we need some other type of information. But tax returns will still most likely be utilized to make sure everything looks correct. And then assets. So students are going to need to know their asset information, such as child support received, their cash, savings, checking, investment net worth, business and farm net worth. And colleges, like I said, they can put up to 20 colleges on their application. So I put that under Dustin because he's super smart and probably will list up to 20 colleges on his application. And then you're going to need federal benefits information. We call these means tested benefits, such as WIC, TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, free and reduced school lunch, those types of things. That is an important part of the FAFSA, which Darcy will cover later. All right, next slide, please. So here's what we don't yet know, and we don't have answers for, and we are eagerly awaiting answers on these questions. We still don't know what the FSA ID process is going to look like with individuals without a social security number. We have some details, but we still haven't really figured out what that's going to look like. We also don't know what the manual process is going to look like when the IRS Direct Data Exchange does not find any information within the IRS database. There will be a manual process for people to still be able to enter their information manually when there is not that match performed. Comment period. So a little while ago, the Department of Education posted the FAFSA for public comment, and there were hundreds, I feel like hundreds and thousands of comments, probably not that many, but it felt like it. I know I definitely commented. I think I put in 16 comments on language, wording, other things on the FAFSA. So are they going to be changing the FAFSA based on that feedback from that open comment period? And then verification. We have our criteria for the upcoming year, but we really don't know what it's going to look like in the future. The federal verification criteria is based on years of data, and that data is being wiped clean because this is a brand new FAFSA. So Department of Education also doesn't really know what they want to verify in the future. So they've set some things for the next year, but moving forward, will those be the same? Will they be more verification, less? Those are questions we don't have answers to yet. All right, moving on to chapter 2, I'm going to turn it over to Darcy.
All right, thanks, Danielle. Good morning, everyone. So who needs a studentaid.gov account, or formerly known as the artist as FSA ID? The student is always going to need a studentaid.gov account, and Danielle talked a lot about role-based completion. So the student's role is always going to be the applicant. They're the ones that are applying, so they are the applicant on the form. And if they are a dependent student, then they will need at least one parent to participate as a contributor, and that parent's role is going to be parent contributor. Then the parent's partner or spouse. So if you remember before on the FAFSA, it was listed as parent 1, parent 2. Now it will be listed as parent and parent's partner or spouse. And so they will need to be listed, but they may or may not need to be a login and be a contributor on the FAFSA. So let's talk about this. So did the parent and parent's partner or spouse file taxes jointly with each other in the base tax year? So if the answer is yes, then only one parent contributor will need to log in with their studentaid.gov account to provide approval and consent. So both parents will still be listed on the FAFSA, but the IRS sees them as one tax entity. So only one of them needs to provide approval and consent for the direct data exchange to pull their FTI over into the FAFSA. So if the parent and parent's partner or spouse did not file taxes jointly with each other in that base tax year, and for the 24-25 FAFSA, the base tax year will be 2022. So the parent will need to provide approval and consent, and then the parent's partner or spouse will also need to log in and provide approval and consent as well. So for an example, let's say that my husband and I were filling out a FAFSA for our 18-year-old. She's a cat, so we're not, but if we could, we did file married filing joint in 2022. So only one of us would need to log in and provide approval and consent. But I have a friend who just got married in June, and so he and his wife did not file their taxes jointly in 2022. So when they go to do his son's FAFSA for 24-25, each of them, him and his wife, will need to log in and provide the approval and consent process. All right, so who needs an account if their student is an independent student? Again, the student's role is going to be applicant. If the student is married, the student spouse, their name and social will have to be listed on the FAFSA now, and they will be considered a spouse contributor. Now, will the spouse always need to log in and provide consent? Again, that depends on their filing status. So if the student and student spouse filed taxes jointly with each other in the base tax year, then only the student would need to provide consent, because again, the IRS sees them as one tax entity. But, and I have a feeling that for a lot of our independent students, especially that are younger, that just got married recently, then yes, the student and student spouse would need to log in because they didn't file taxes jointly in that base tax year. So again, it's going to go back to how they filed taxes with each other, or if they did or did not, to who needs to provide consent on the FAFSA. Next slide, please. All right, so I know we had a few questions about, can students go ahead and create that FSA ID, or do they need to wait? So the process is going to remain virtually unchanged for those that have a Social Security number. The biggest change is that creating the studentaid.gov account will require a verifiable email address. And so if you have students and parents right now that have a Social Security number, absolutely, they can go ahead and create that studentaid.gov account if they don't already have one. So you could go ahead and, if you wanted to have a FAFSA information night in October and discuss these changes and go ahead and have them set up those studentaid.gov accounts, that would be fine. The only individuals that will need to wait are those that do not have a Social Security number, because that process is not ready just yet. And it is going to be very important, and this is where we're going to need your help in this process, making sure that students and parents know that that studentaid.gov account must be created before they fill out the FAFSA, at least 3 days before they fill out the FAFSA, because that account must be created and verified through the Social Security Administration before the FAFSA can be completed. Because if it hasn't been through that SSA or Social Security Administration database match and been verified, then they will not be able to provide consent on their FAFSA. And as Danielle mentioned, if they do not provide consent, they're not eligible for federal student aid. So they'd have to go back in and provide consent later. But so just for the ease and simplification of everything, it's going to be best for them to set up those accounts at least 3 business days before they want to start the FAFSA, so that they don't have any issues with it when they go to do their FAFSA. Next slide, please. All right, so what is this account creation without a Social Security number going to look like? As you saw on the previous screen, there's a checkbox down at the bottom that says, I don't have a Social Security number. So they'll check that. And then they will answer a series of knowledge-based identity questions. If you've ever had to confirm your identity by answering questions such as, we see that you took out a mortgage loan in 2003. What bank currently holds that mortgage loan? Or you bought a car in what year? Those types of identity questions, this is what this process is going to look like, a little bit similar to that. So if the user passes the knowledge-based process, the account will be created and able to be used immediately. If let's say that they don't have any credit or they can't answer those questions, there will be an additional process available to create the account. And this is where we're not exactly sure what this process is going to look like, but federal student aid is going to have some process that they can provide identity documents. So they can provide their driver's license or other documents that will prove who they are. And once that is submitted and processed, then they could receive that account creation at that point in time. If they are unable to create an account, a paper FAFSA can be submitted. So a paper FAFSA is still going to be an option, but remember that's going to take at least 4 to 6 weeks for processing. So it's going to be best to try and get them through the studentaid.gov account process as opposed to going the paper FAFSA route. But that is an option there in a worst case scenario. All right. So what does this ID match and verification look like? So at the start, does the user have a social security number? Yes, they go through the Social Security Administration database match. And if it matches, then the user identity is verified and they're good to go. If the user has a social, but they fail the Social Security Administration database match, then the user will need to update their information on the FAFSA and their studentaid.gov account, or they will need to contact the Social Security Administration to resolve it. And then they go back through the database match. If the user does not have a social, then they will go through the knowledge base verification process. If that is confirmed, then their user identity is verified, their account is created. If they fail that knowledge base verification, then they'll have to go through the ID proof. And then once that's completed, then they'll have that account created. Next slide, please. All right, some frequently asked questions and some tips with the studentaid.gov accounts. What if I don't create my account early? So what if time just gets away from me and I'm like, oh, I need to start my FAFSA tonight, or somebody's coming out to my high school to help me with the FAFSA, but I forgot to set up my account. They can go ahead and start the FAFSA, but they're not going to be able to provide approval and consent until the database match has been successfully completed. So that's going to hold up the processing of their FAFSA, and they're going to have to remember to log back in once that database match is done. So create the account early. Do I need to create a new account if I have an FSA ID or studentaid.gov account already? No. And in fact, the account is tied to the Social Security number, so you wouldn't be able to create a second account. So if you have parents who have siblings, older siblings in college already, they do not need to create a new account. They would continue to use the same one. If a student already has one, they would not need to create a new one. When should they create the account? So again, if students and parents have a Social Security number, go ahead and get them starting that creation process now. Just remember to keep the username and password in a safe location. And probably the most important now is, can my parent create my account for me, or can I create my account for my parent? No. It is very important that only the account owner has control of their username and password information, because this is how the approval and consent process is provided to the IRS. So students should not be giving their login information to the parents, and parents should not be giving their login information to the student, because they are authorizing the IRS for this very secure data to be pulled over into their FAFSA. So everyone needs to only do their own role and make sure that they keep that information safe and secure. All right, I will pause for a moment. Did we have any questions that in the chat that needed addressed on the studentaid.gov account?
We did, Darcy.
Okay.
Let's go back here. So question from Emma is, should we have the students set up FSA IDs now or before the new ones open, or will that process be totally new?
Hopefully I just answered that, but yes, if your student and parents have Social Security numbers, they can go ahead and start setting up those accounts now so that they're ready whenever the FAFSA opens. My guess is December 22nd, right before they leave for Christmas. So if we're throwing out dates out there and guesses, that's where I'm going to officially rank mine at. So the only people that need to wait to start their account creation are those that do not have a social security number, because that process isn't ready yet. They have said that it should be ready by the beginning of December for that student account creation for those that do not have social security numbers.
That was the only question related to FSA ID. The others are over other sections we're going to cover.
Okay, perfect. Thank
Can I
you.
ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so does the FSA ID area, that like where you go into that website, into that section to create the account, are there different questions, or does that look the exact same as from past years?
It does look the same. And so it will be name, address, social security number, date of birth, the email address. It will have the two-factor authentication. So they'll need to have a phone and or email on there so that they can receive that code for that two-factor authentication.
So that hasn't changed.
Correct.
Awesome, I like that. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so moving into chapter 3, the parent process and scenarios. So Leah, next slide, please. More lovingly referred to as who is my parent? So here we have some big changes with the who is considered the parent. In a case where families, the parents are divorced or separated, the parent of record or the parent contributor is no longer the residential parent. So previously it was which parent has the student lived with more in the last 12 months. That is no longer the case. It is now the parent who provides more than 50% of the financial support for the student in the preceding 12 months prior to the FAFSA being filled out. If it is truly an even 50-50 split right down the middle in financial support, then the parent contributor needs to be the parent who has the greater income or assets. And how does child support factor into who's paying more than 50% or providing more than 50% of the support for the student? So the amount of child support that is paid is contributed to, when you're looking at the 50%, you need to give credit for the child support to the parent paying the child support when calculating who's providing more than 50% of that student support. So let's say that my husband and I are divorced and we have done the math and I have provided $20,000 for the kid over the last year, as has he, but part of the $20,000 that I provided was actually child support that he had paid to me. So that would tip the scales over to him, because part of how I supported the student was that child support that I had received from him. So again, if the parent paying the child support, that amount tips the scales over 50% in their favor, then they would be the parent that needs to be provided. So it's going, or listed. So it's going to really come down to the family setting down and looking at where the financial support for the student comes from and determining which of them is providing more than 50% of that support. Next slide, please.
Real quick, Darcy, to add on that, because there are a few questions in the chat, but I think you answered them. In my entire 20-year career in financial aid, I've never actually seen a true 50-50. There's always a parent that is paying a little bit more, or a higher cost to maintaining their household with that child in it. So I would encourage you to look at whose health insurance they're on, if they have a cell phone plan, who's paying that, car insurance, if the student is in sports, or who's paying those kinds of things. Because when I get parents to kind of think about that, I've never had a case where it is literally an exact amount.
I would agree with that. All right, so the FAFSA will have a parent wizard on it now. So the student will initially log in. They will see a onboarding videos that tells them about the FAFSA process, and then they'll answer the dependency questions just like they had before. Once that's been determined that they are a dependent student, then it's going to bring them to this parent wizard. And so the first question it's going to ask is, are your parents married to each other? And there's a little notation on here. On the FAFSA form, your parent is your legal parent or step parent who supports you financially. So by legal, the biological or adoptive parent. So the first thing it's going to ask is, are your parents married to each other? If yes, then it's going to take you to the invitation screen. You list out the parent's name, date of birth, social, email address, at the very minimum, name and email address to send that invitation. So what happens if you answer no to the are the parents married to each other question? Then it's going to give you some additional questions. It's going to ask, do the biological or adoptive parents live together? And if no, then did one parent provide more financial support than the other parent over the past 12 months? And if you answer yes to this, then has the parent you identified in the previous question remarried? And you'd answer yes or no. So then, based upon the answers to this question, it's going to say, these are the parents that you need to have listed, and it takes them to the invitation page so that they can invite those parent contributors. So it's helping them think through who needs to be listed as a parent on their FAFSA and invited to that parent contributor role. Next slide, please. And again, here is what that invitation screen looks like. So it'll have the parent, they'll list the name. If they have the date of birth and social, they'll include that. If not, like I said, the parent and email address at a minimum. And then the parent spouse you see is optional because, again, not everybody may need to list a parent spouse. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but even if the student doesn't invite the parent spouse to be a contributor, once the parent gets in there and determines based upon their tax filing status that the parent spouse or partner needs to be a contributor, they can send an invitation to them themselves. And so then they will click continue. So here's a little bit about the process. Sorry, Leah. So once the student has invited the parent contributor, it will then take the student directly into the student financial section so the student can finish filling out their part of the FAFSA. As soon as the student hits continue on or hits the invite parent button on this screen, it's going to immediately send an email to the parent in real time. The parent can get that. They can immediately log in and start the parent section. So you can actually have your student and parent sitting side by side working on each section of the FAFSA at the same time. So they don't have to sit there and wait for one to get done before the other one can start on their section. So this will actually help expedite the process a little bit. Not to mention the fact that there's many fewer questions. Again, this will be in real time. That invitation goes immediately and the parent will be able to access that section as soon as they get that invitation. And then I do want to add that the student will be able to log into studentaid.gov and see the status. So they'll be able to see if their parent has logged in and submitted their section. So they can kind of keep an eye on that and keep track if the parent's done their part or not, so they know whether they need to go back and talk to them. Okay, ready for the next slide now. All right. So let's talk about some scenarios in determining which parents need to be invited. So scenario one, the biological or adoptive parents are married to each other. They would just need to invite one parent. They could invite the other parent if the first parent fails to complete the parent section. Both parents will have their information listed on the FAFSA, But remember, if they were married filing joint in the base tax year, only one of them will need to provide approval and consent for the federal taxpayer information to be brought over into the FAFSA. So I'm going to go over to scenario 3 next. The biological or adoptive parents are not married, but they do live together. Again, the student would need to invite one parent. They could invite the other parent if the first one fails to complete, but again, both parents will be listed on the FAFSA, and depending on their taxpayer or their tax filing status will depend on if just one needs to contribute or if both of them need to contribute, but all of their information will be included on the FAFSA. Scenario 2, the parents are divorced or separated. They will need to invite the parent who is providing more than 50% of the financial support. And then they can also, in scenario 4, if that parent of record that we determine in scenario 2, if that parent is remarried, the spouse will need to be included on the FAFSA, and then it will again depend on the tax filing status of the parent and the parent spouse to determine if both need to be contributors for the consent piece or if just one. But again, the parent can send an invitation to the spouse if they were married filing separately or they did not file taxes jointly with each other during that base tax year, and so that they can do their approval and consent. All right. Do we have any questions that we need to pause for, Emily?
Yes. I'll let Emily read it.
That's okay. So there was a recent question. So it was, what if the student has a parent that has passed away? Does it direct them to click something about that?
So is there, I guess the follow-up question would be, is there still a living parent in that case? And so they would, if there is, then they would use that living parent. And unless there was an unusual circumstance that they, it was detrimental for them to have contact with that other parent, then they'd go into that unusual circumstance question. But and I saw the response of yes in there. So my initial response is going to be they need to use the other parent's information. And then if and this is something that's still unanswered, because if the parent and the deceased parent were married filing joint in 2022, it's going to pull that information over. But the parent's still going to have to answer their marital status. It may end up becoming a special circumstance that they need to go talk to the financial aid office about once the FAFSA has been submitted, because it may not let them separate out the income to remove the income of the deceased parent without causing the FAFSA to become invalid. So it may be a situation where they go ahead and submit it as the information comes across and then talk to the financial aid office about a professional judgment for special circumstance.
And there is a widowed question on the FAFSA. So I'm hoping that if a person indicates they are widowed, that it will allow them to manually provide their information. But again, we're just not quite sure of that.
And I just saw the question, would that financial aid office be at their university? Yes, any university that they are considering going to that they've submitted their FAFSA, that would be the financial aid office that they should reach out and talk to about that. And each financial aid office at each institution may have a slightly different process for professional judgment. So that's why I'd recommend reaching out to each office that they have sent the FAFSA to.
And Darcy, do emails used in the invite to parents have to match the emails when the parent sets up the studentaid.gov account?
No, because they'll log in to studentaid.gov with their login information. So theoretically it doesn't, but I would also recommend that if they're no longer using the email address that they use to set up their studentaid.gov account, they can update that email address pretty easily in the dashboard of studentaid.gov. So I would go ahead and recommend that they update to their current contact information, because again, if anything happens in the world again, where there might be another loan repayment pause or something like that, the U.S. Department of Education uses the contact information in those studentaid.gov accounts to reach out to FAFSA filers and borrowers. So it's important that that information always is up to date.
And then there was another one, I believe you answered it, but we can go over it again. In cases of divorce or separation, the student will report the parent information, or sorry, I'm reading my answer, I apologize. Divorced parents, so only one parent needs an account, correct? And we report both parents are only the one who provides over 50% of financial support.
For divorced or separated parents, it is only one parent that needs to be listed, and it's the parent that's providing more than half of the support. Now, if that parent is remarried, then the current step parent also must be included on the FAFSA, including their financial information. And if the parent and the parent spouse did not file taxes jointly in 2022 for this 24-25 FAFSA, then both of them would need an account. But yes, in a case where the biological parents are divorced or separated, the biological parents would never both be listed on the FAFSA together unless they were living together. That's the only time in a case of biological parents not being married that they would both be on there, is only if they were living together still.
I have a question.
Sure.
I may be getting ahead of myself, but I work in a high school, so this will happen. What if kids' parents like live in town, but they don't file taxes, anything like that, but the student doesn't live with parents, they live with grandparent, not through any legal type of scenario, just that's who they live with. Who's considered the parent in that situation? If the kid lives with grandparents, parents are in town, but they don't file taxes, the kid doesn't live with parents. Am I ahead of myself, or?
Yes.
Leah's getting ready to do unusual circumstances.
Okay.
So I'm gonna leave that one until she's done with her section.
Sounds good, thank you.
Emily, are we good to continue on?
There are
So
some additional questions.
yeah, there's several questions that came through. I had one come directly to me, and it's kind of tied into this. So they said, did they ever explain the purpose behind stressing the different roles between parents and children, specifically stating that the parents and children should not have access to each other's accounts?
Yes, so that is ultimately very much tied to this approval and consent process for the IRS, because all of the legal jargon that Danielle showed you at the beginning, they have to read through that. They have to agree that they consent to the IRS to use that information and for it to be pulled over. The IRS is incredibly protective of all of our federal taxpayer information. So not only is it important that only each contributor is providing their own consent, but federal student aid had to update their systems to make sure that they could keep this data secure. There's going to be special flags when the data comes into us that we have to take extra precautionary steps to keep this data secure. So they do not want someone who is not the taxpayer providing consent for their information to be used, because that information belongs to the taxpayer. So the taxpayer is the only one that can provide that consent. Similarly, it used to be that as financial aid administrators, we could enter the FAFSA data into a system for the student, or a student or parent could hire a preparer and they would just give all the information to that person. The person would fill out the FAFSA. There's no longer a preparer role for the FAFSA moving forward, and there's no longer an option for us to enter all FAFSA data on behalf of a student, because neither the preparer nor us as financial aid administrators can provide consent on behalf of the taxpayer.
There are still a few questions, Darcy.
Okay.
Do students need their parent's social security number to invite them, or do they just need the parent's email address?
They just are required to have the email address. It's would be good if they had the date of birth and social, but the parent will have to confirm that when they get in there, and it will actually tie to their studentaid.gov account. I know not all parents are comfortable giving their social to their student, so I think that's why ultimately the required information will be name and email.
And are the rules about parents the same as previous years?
Might need a little more elaboration.
I had answered this in the chat. No, they're not the same because we're moving away from who you lived with in the most recent 12-month period. That's gone, and we're moving towards who provides support. So it's all about the support, not who the student lives with.
And I saw a question from Emma. Could you have a situation with 4 parents, the bio parents remarried and step parents not filing jointly? So no, you will only ever have 2 parents listed on the FAFSA. And in the case where the bio parents are divorced, it would be whichever the bio parents is providing more than half of the support for the student, it will be them as the primary parent, and then their current spouse as the parent's partner or spouse. So you'll only ever have at most 2 parents listed on there, and it will depend on the current marital status of the parent that's providing more than half of the support.
So I think a really good way to frame this, because there's always a lot of confusion around this, is that this is all about which household, like which financial support household the student is a part of, right? They're trying to look at everything that's provided in that particular situation. So this is why you're not looking at multiple households that the student might be a part of, or you're not looking at these outside resources, right? When we're defining who a parent is, we're looking at a biological parent, an adoptive parent, a legal parent, right? So, we do have these other circumstances in which students might be living with aunts and uncles or grandparents, but they're not their legal parent. We're not looking at their information, their financial information. We're specifically looking at who's defined as a parent and then who's contributing to that situation for the student. So if a parent is reported on the FAFSA and that is who the student has selected as providing the most financial support, what is that situation that's going on with that student and that parent? And then you're adding whether or not that parent is married or not, right? So if that parent is remarried, then you're adding that information to it. So they're trying to look at what all is happening with those decisions that are being made in those questions. So I don't know if that helped clear it up, because as I kept talking, it was kind of more confusing, but that's.
Well, I think that's an excellent segue into unusual circumstances, so we can get through the rest of our slides.
Sure. All right, so for the section for unusual circumstances, we're first going to start talking about dependency status real quick. So if you've gone through FAFSA training before, or you've filled out the FAFSA before, you may know that there's a variety of different questions that a student is actually answering on their form to determine whether or not they are required to put parent information on the FAFSA. And so this is what we refer to as dependency questions. So what you'll see on the slide here is a list of what those questions are really kind of referring to. So this is going to be in the personal circumstances portion of the student's form. So the first thing that the FAFSA is kind of looking at is, are they 24 years of age or older? The second thing that it's looking at is the student married? But then it will also ask a variety of other questions to see if, if they're not 24 years of age or older and they're not married, are they considered to be an independent student through other situations? So those questions will be, are they currently serving, or are they a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces? Does the student have any children or other dependents that they provide half of the financial support for within a certain time frame? And then it will also ask questions about being an orphan, ward of court, or in foster care after the age of 13. So has the student, was the student orphan, ward of court, or in foster care after the age of 13? Those questions used to sort of be combined. You know, they've approached those questions a few different ways on the form before, but now those questions will actually be separated into 3 different questions. So the student can select one or multiple of those if that applies to them. In addition to that, the FAFSA does ask, was the student or is the student a legally emancipated minor, as determined by a court in the state that they're a resident in. So that's not a new question, that's always been asked. And then it will also ask about a legal guardianship situation. So is or was the student in a legal guardianship situation with someone other than their parent or step parent? So this could be like when a grandparent or an aunt and uncle, maybe they have some sort of legal guardianship that was determined by a court in their state for the student that's applying. If that applies to them, this is where they could check that box and say that they were in that situation. So all of those questions are asked on the FAFSA. And if a student says no to all of these questions, then they would be considered a dependent student, and they would be required to put parent information on the FAFSA. And there's a few different exceptions to that, but generally, if a student says no to all these questions, they're typically going to go on to provide parent information on the FAFSA. If a student says yes to any of these questions, then they're going to be considered independent, and they're not going to need to put parent information on the FAFSA to move forward in the form. So the last bullet point that you'll see there is asking whether or not the student is homeless. And so let me get to the next slide. So on the FAFSA, there will be a single question now that asks if at any time on or after July 1st of 2023, and this is for the 24-25 FAFSA, it will ask, was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So let me talk a little bit about what that means. So the way that we're defining unaccompanied in this place would be when a student is not living in the physical custody of a parent or a guardian. And self-supporting in this case would be defined as when a student pays for his or her own living expenses, which includes paying for fixed, regular, and adequate housing. When we're looking at homeless or at risk of being homeless, homeless would be defined as lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And at risk of being homeless would be when a student's housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. For example, if they are being evicted and they are currently unable to live in their current residence or another residence, that would be fixed, regular, and adequate housing. So those are sort of the definitions of what it is that they're asking. So again, it's asking, was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So if the student says yes to that question, then the FAFSA is going to ask, did any of the following entities, and you'll see on the screen here what's listed, did any of the following entities determine that the student was homeless or at risk of being homeless? And so the entities that can now determine that is the director or designee of an emergency or transitional shelter, or a street outreach program, homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving those that are experiencing homelessness. A student's high school or their school district homeless liaison can provide that determination. A director or designee of the federal TRIO program or Gear Up programs, they can also provide a homeless determination. And now also financial aid administrators can provide a homeless determination. So really the student would just need to select if one of these entities have provided that determination. And then as a financial aid administrator, we will be required to collect that documentation if this is the first time that a student has identified themselves as being homeless or at risk of being homeless. Anything to add to that slide, Danielle or Darcy?
I just want to say that the TRIO designation or designator, so TRIO Gear Up folks can make a homeless youth determination. That is in effect for this current FAFSA year, 23-24. So this is not going to be moving forward. This is actually right now. So just know that if you are a TRIO Gear Up professional, you can make a homeless determination for a student.
Yeah, I think the other thing with documentation, what we have been guided to look at is on a case-by-case basis. We're looking at a written statement from a student that confirms that they're an unaccompanied homeless youth or that they're at risk of being homeless. And this is in the case if we're making a decision, we have to make that decision without regard to the reasons as to why they're homeless or unaccompanied. So we're really just trying to determine, does the student kind of meet this definition? And if they do, then we can determine them as meeting the definition. So I hope that kind of helps. Okay. So if a student goes through those various dependency questions and they've said no to all of them, and even if they go through the homeless question and they say no to that, they will still be asked if they have any unusual circumstances. And so remember that unusual circumstances is a new term that will be used during the 2024-2025 FAFSA. It's basically trying to encompass anything that would make a student would have a student find it difficult to receive parent information for their FAFSA form. So probably on your screen, it's a little small, but I will read it to you. So the question itself will ask, do unusual circumstances prevent the student from contacting their parents, or would contacting their parents pose a risk to the student? And it then provides a variety of situations that might be considered unusual circumstances. So for example, did the student have to leave home due to an abusive or threatening environment? Is their parent incarcerated? Or their parents are incarcerated and contact with them would pose a risk to them? Are they unable to locate their parents? So there are a variety of situations in which a student might not meet those initial independent questions, and they might not technically be homeless or at risk of homelessness, but it would be pretty impossible for them to provide parent information on the FAFSA. And so previously, there wasn't really a way for them to fully identify themselves on the FAFSA form in this way. So now they will be able to identify that. And if they do say yes to this question, their FAFSA will still be able to go through the process of having a student aid index calculated. So that's kind of the biggest change here, is that they will get what's called a provisional independent student status, which means that they'll say, hey, you look like you're going to be an independent student. We're going to calculate your FAFSA just based off of your information. But this is provisional until you follow up with your school with some information and documentation for what needs to happen next. But the FAFSA will go ahead and calculate the student aid index and provide that information to them at the end of the process. And then they'll be directed to go talk to their financial aid office at the college or university that they're wanting to attend to finish out that process so that that independent status can become permanent. So that second screenshot there just shows kind of the explanation that will be provided to the student if they do have that provisional independent student status. Okay. So if the student does not have any unusual circumstances, so let's say none of those types of situations apply and they say no to that question, then the FAFSA will move on to the next question, which is asking whether or not the parent is unwilling to provide their information on the FAFSA form. So this question clearly asks, are the student's parents unwilling to provide their information, but the student doesn't have an unusual circumstance that prevents them from contacting or obtaining their parents' information? So this would be a situation in which, like, okay, they are living with parents or they're still in contact with parents, but the parents just really don't want to provide anything on that FAFSA form for whatever reason. If the student says that the parents are unwilling to provide that information, then the student can continue to fill out their form, but they're only going to be able to be considered for an unsubsidized loan. And that's not new. That's always been the case. The only difference here is that now that question is actually on this form, and it actually explains to them that if this is the way that they answer, they will only be considered for an unsubsidized loan. So we are a little afraid that this is going to be a confusing question for students and families. So we really want them to pay attention to this particular question and answer it correctly, because if they do answer it incorrectly and they say, I just want to be considered for an unsubsidized loan, but parents actually would provide information on the FAFSA and are totally willing to do so, then it's going to cause a lot of confusion for the student, the family, and for us as well. So it's really important that when they get to this question, they're paying attention. And if the parents are willing to provide information, that they're answering in the correct way. Whoop, I don't. Okay, so they're supposed to be, there we go. All right, it just took a second for it to show up. Okay, so our recommendation for these types of unusual circumstances is to always have students follow up with their colleges to see what documentation they will need in order to confirm their unusual circumstance with their college. As Darcy mentioned earlier, this process can look a little different at each college or university that the student may be considering. And so if you're working with students who are looking at multiple schools, they're going to have to do that documentation process at each of the schools that they actually want a financial aid offer from. And if they are transferring from one school to another, their experience of this documentation process might look a little different from one school to another. So very important to have them follow up with their school with that process. Because if they do not follow up and they don't finish the process, the financial aid office will not be able to review them for federal aid eligibility because they won't be able to calculate an official student aid index or SAI number. So therefore, there's no federal eligibility. The other thing to keep in mind here is that financial aid offices are now required to follow up with any students who are listed as a provisionally independent student 60 days after enrollment. So within those 60 days after the student enrolls, they do have to follow up with those provisionally independent students to say, hey, we need to determine your official dependency status. Let's go through that process. Here's the steps to do that. So if you have questions or want to learn more about what those unusual and special circumstance processes look like and want to go through some more scenarios on those, we do have a session upcoming on October 17th that we will be providing for a deep dive into those topics. And so if you scan the QR code there, it will take you to our KASFAA website where you can register for that presentation. So I'm going to pause for a couple seconds so you can scan and go.
Emily also dropped the link in the chat. So if you'd rather click it and register on your computer, that's an option as well.
Okay. All All right, so let's talk a little bit about FAFSA changes. So there are some questions on the FAFSA that are changing, or some definitions of certain questions that are changing. So the first big one is family size. Again, if you have gone through a training before with a previous FAFSA, or you have filled out the form yourself, you may remember a portion of the FAFSA being called household size. Household size is now going to be called family size. And the question on the FAFSA is going to ask if the family size is different than the number of individuals that were claimed on the 2022 taxes that are being reported. So if it's not different, then the student will say, no, it's not different. And we'll just use that information from those taxes to determine the family size. But if it is different, then they would need to say yes. And then they would enter the number of children or other dependents who live with their parent and will receive more than half of their support within that time frame. So I think the big thing here is to remember that the FAFSA is using prior year tax information. And so for the 24-25 FAFSA, we're looking at 2022 tax information. You know, lots of things can change in between a 2-year time frame. So for example, they could have another child. And so if that is different, if their household looks a little different, their family size looks a little different than what's on that tax information, they need to provide that additional information so that's correct on the form. Another question that you all may be aware of on the FAFSA is that the student is required to also report the number in college. So this is basically asking how many people in that family size that was reported will also be attending college in that same time frame. And so there's a huge change with this in that although the FAFSA will still ask for the number in college, the formula that determines a student's federal aid eligibility will actually no longer take this number into consideration. So if you're a financial aid nerd and you have kind of done a behind the scenes calculation and you understand how number in college used to affect aid eligibility, you might know that basically what happened is that they would take this number in college and divide the EFC by that number to determine, you know, a breakdown of the student's EFC. That is no longer happening. So this could affect quite a few families who may have been eligible, let's say for Pell, because they had multiple children in college at the same time. That number in college is no longer going to be taken into consideration. So they might lose their Pell eligibility as a result. So just something to keep in mind that aid eligibility could change because of this formula change. All right. In addition to those other changes, once a student gets to the college selection portion of the FAFSA form, they will actually be able to select up to 20 colleges on their FAFSA. So for any of your students out there who are, you know, super pumped about going to college and they just can't make a decision, they can add up to 20 colleges on their form, and all 20 of those colleges can receive that FAFSA form once it's submitted. So really great change. All right, so I will turn it over to Darcy.
Right. Just a heads up, I know we're getting near our time, so we will continue the presentation. Just a reminder that it is being recorded if you do need to leave, but the recording will be available later. And we will also create a question and answer document that we'll post on the website later that addresses the questions that have been asked today. So if you haven't felt like there's already enough changes to the FAFSA. Let's talk about some more. So there are several questions leaving the FAFSA. So the intent with the FAFSA Simplification Act was just that, to simplify things. Really, it's simplified. Yeah. So all these changes. But they do want the process to be easier for students and parents, which I do feel that it will be. But these questions are leaving the FAFSA for 24-25. It will no longer ask their housing choice. So if they're planning on living on campus, off campus, or with parents, any untaxed income that does not appear on their 1040 tax return will no longer be included on the FAFSA, because they want to pull from as many databases as they can. It will no longer ask the student if they're eligible or if they're interested in federal work study. They'll just need to work with their financial aid office to determine their federal work study eligibility and what the process is at that institution for obtaining a work study job. Taxable earnings from need-based employment. That is questions being removed. They will still be including earnings from federal work study in the income allowance for or income protection allowance for need-based employment, but only from federal work study, and they're getting that information from us now. It will no longer ask for the student's driver's license number and state. No longer ask for the highest level of schooling completed by the parent. It will not ask what college degree or certificate the student will be working on when they begin the school year. It will not ask if the Schedule I was filed or if they were a dislocated worker. All right. So how is the SAI formula different? So SAI stands for Student Aid Index. So the EFC, or expected family contribution, is going away. It's being replaced by the SAI. So it's going to be calculated kind of the same, but a little differently. So this is the, these are the changes. So it's reducing the number of income items and allowances against the income, which you'll see on a future slide. However, the income protection allowance is higher, and it has changed items included as assets. So child support received is no longer considered income. It's now considered an asset. And then the net worth of all businesses and for-profit farms will be included regardless of the size of that business or farm. Excuse me. Changes to the definition of family size that Leah just discussed. She discussed the removal of number in college. Currently, the EFC can only go as low as 0, so it may not be a true representation of the neediest students. So now the SAI can actually go down to -1500. So we'll see a more accurate representation of where the need of our students falls. No allowance to prorate the SAI for periods of enrollment less than 9 months. That's really a financial aid office thing to work through. It does implement separate Pell Grant eligibility determinations, which Danielle is going to discuss in a moment. And the available income can be a negative amount now, where before you would just list 0 if the income calculation ended up being a negative. All right, so I said there were some changes to income. So right now, everything that you see on the left-hand side of the screen is the income data that is used to calculate the EFC, or expected family contribution. You can see the list on the right for the Student Aid Index is much shorter. So now the only income data items that will go into the SAI formula is the adjusted gross income, deductible payments to the SEP, Simple, KEO, or other investments, tax-exempt interest, untaxed portions of IRA distributions and pensions, unless it was rolled over into another qualifying account, and a foreign income exclusion. Next slide, please. All right, so there's also changes to the allowances against income. So you will see, again, there are fewer items that are used in those allowances in the student aid index formula. Notable is this third bullet point for EFC, the taxable earnings from need-based employment. Now it's just looking at the need-based earnings from federal work study. And then moving to the next slide. So changes to asset information. So previously, the assets for EFC that were asked was cash savings and checking accounts, net worth of investments, including real estate, but excluding the primary residence that the family lives in, and the adjusted net worth of business and farms, excluding businesses with fewer than 100 full-time employees or family farms. So this is a big change you'll see for the student aid index. Now the assets are cash savings, checking, time deposits, and money market funds. The net worth of investments, including real estate, excluding primary residence, that one didn't change. The adjusted net worth of all businesses and farms, and annual child support received, because remember, that's no longer considered income. That is now an asset. So they would take the amount of child support received during the most recent calendar year, and that will be the amount that they report for the asset for child support received. All right, next slide, please, Leah. And so changes to allowances against assets. In the EFC, it was education savings and an asset protection allowance. For the SAI, it is just the asset protection allowance. But I have some good news coming up. So there's no longer a simplified needs test. However, there are still some students that are going to be excluded from being required to report their assets. So for dependent students, if the applicant qualifies for the maximum Pell Grant, they will not be asked the asset questions. If the applicant's parents in 2022, their combined adjusted gross income was less than $60,000, and they did not file Schedule A, B, D, E, F, or H, and they did not file a Schedule C, or the Schedule C they did file has a net business income of not more than a $10,000 loss or gain, they would not be required to list their assets. Or if the applicant or applicant's parents received a benefit under a means-tested federal benefit program, as Danielle mentioned earlier, WIC, TANF, any of those, during 2022 or 2023, they would not be required to report assets. The next slide is the exempt from asset reporting for independent students. It's literally the exact same criteria, except that it's applicant and applicant's spouse if they're married. So the parents would no longer be a factor in this because independent students don't have to put their parents' information. All right. So here's some good news. When looking at the qualified education savings accounts, the 529 plans, previously, if a parent had a 529 plan for multiple students or multiple children, they had to include that value as an asset for all of the 529 plans that they owned. Now, the parent will only include the value of the educational savings account for that they have where the student is that beneficiary. So if there's 3 other younger siblings in the house and they have plans for all of them, they would not include the values for those 3 younger siblings. It would just be for the student themselves. So if the dependent student is the beneficiary, this 529 plan is going to be counted as a parent's asset. If an independent student is the beneficiary, no matter who owns the account, it's going to be counted as the student's asset. All right. So calculating net worth. I know this is a big question for a lot of people. So in this the top two have not changed. So your net worth is going to be the current value of your investments, businesses, and or farms minus any debts currently owed against those same items. Again, the value of your primary residence does not count as an investment or the debt against it. So with our businesses and farm values, calculating that net worth, what are you going to look at? The market value of land, buildings, machinery, equipment, and inventory. Any debt that is against those same items. So if those items have been used for collateral, you're going to subtract out what's currently owed on those items. So you'll take the current market value, subtract out any debt against those items. That will be the net worth. If the primary residence is on the farm, you will exclude the value and debt of that primary residence. This language was taken from the draft FAFSA. Because of that comment period that Danielle mentioned earlier, they are still making updates to the draft FAFSA. So if you happen to find a copy of it and take a look at it, just know that they are still working on finessing the wording. So some of this wording can change, but these items will have to be included for 24-25. All right, so next slide. So I know this has been a lot of information. You're like, what is going on? Truly, this is going to be a simplified process for the students and parents. It's going to be an easier process for them to fill out. There's less questions that they have to answer. Maybe a little more complicated for us on the back end, but for the students and parents, I do fully believe that it's going to be a much smoother process for them. More information is accessed through the data exchange, which means less information that the students and parents have to provide or manually enter. And I know there's a big concern, and a lot of people feel that these changes are negatively impacting middle-class families. We really, truly don't know what the outcome is going to be until we have all of the data to be able to see all of these different scenarios. However, with the data that we do have, I can tell you that due to the changes in how Pell eligibility is being calculated, while there are a few students that may lose Pell eligibility because of the change in asset reporting and because of the number in college, there is overall, most schools are seeing a significant increase in the number of Pell eligible students and the amount of Pell that they're going to be eligible for. So truly, these changes are, I think, going to benefit more students than they're harming. All right, Danielle, take it away.
Okay, I know we're at time, but we are just going to continue with the presentation because it will be recorded and we don't want to rush through any information since we can all go back and watch the recording later. So we'll just keep continuing on. If you need to leave, that's okay. This will be posted to the KASFAA website. So let's talk about calculating Pell Grants and how that's going to change. Next slide, please. So I do want to reiterate what Darcy just said. There's a lot of questions in the chat about possibly this affecting small family farms negatively, but there are changes to other parts of the SAI calculation that actually are going to be benefiting students. So while yes, everyone now will have to report their net worth, even if it's a small business with fewer than 100 full-time employees, you still got to report it, and now family farm income or family farm investments will have to be reported. But the way the different calculations are going to kind of make up for that, and the fact that Pell Grant is being expanded out to more students. So I know we're kind of at the end, so let's all take a deep breath. There's a lot of numbers on this screen, but I promise you it'll be less confusing once we get through this. So we're going to talk about how Pell Grants are going to be calculated. For those of you in the TRIO world, you probably recognize this chart. This comes from the Health and Human Services Department, and it is the Poverty Guidelines chart. So this is what a Pell Grant is now going to be based on, is the family size and the AGI, or adjusted gross income. And then depending on if a student is independent or dependent, so if they have to report parent information or they don't have to report parent information, If they are married, not married, that's going to determine the amount of Pell Grant that a person can receive. So let's go ahead and work through some examples for a dependent student. So this is a student that would need to report their parent information on the FAFSA. So the first step is you're going to determine the state of legal residence. So Alaska and Hawaii are going to have different poverty guidelines. This is for the lower 48. And then you're going to determine the parent's marital status. Either the student is going to have, the one parent on the FAFSA or two, and you'll determine the parent marital status. Based on that, you can figure out how much Pell Grant they're going to receive. This is really going to help us at financial aid nights, because if a parent gives us the number in their family and their AGI, we can quickly tell them if they're going to qualify for a Pell Grant. In years past, those of us who've been in financial aid for a long time can kind of do rough calculations in our head, and it's much harder to project if a family is going to get the Pell Grant or not. This makes it really straightforward. So for example, a student can get the maximum Pell Grant, and we don't have those amounts yet. And if their parent is a single parent and their AGI is less than or equal to 225% of the poverty guideline, and there are 3 in their family, and their AGI is less than 51,818, they're going to get a Pell Grant if it's at or less than that. Automatic max Pell. So if a family comes to you and they're like, I make 50,000 a year, I've got 2 kids, I'm single, what will my student get? You can say max Pell based on this chart. So it makes it far easier. Now, if the parents are married, so there's another chart right below the first one. There are 2 different charts for this. So it's a 2-parent household, and their AGI is less than or equal to 175% of the poverty guideline, then they can get a Pell Grant as well, the maximum Pell. So for example, on this chart, a family size of 3 is 40,303. If their AGI is equal to or less than that, then they automatically qualify for the maximum Pell Grant. Now, if they don't qualify for maximum Pell, they can still get a minimum Pell Grant. And it's the same chart, but it's a different poverty guideline. So for the top chart, a single parent, if their AGI is less than or equal to 325% of the poverty guideline, for a family size of 3 and their AGI is 74,848, then they automatically get a minimum Pell Grant. So do you see how much that income level has changed? In years past, if you're a family size of 3 and you're at 74,000, you do not get a Pell Grant at all. That's just too high. But in the new calculation and in our new world that we're living in, this family could qualify for a Pell Grant. If it's a 2-parent household, the AGI needs to be less than or equal to 275%. And that's the second chart on the bottom. So for a family size of 3, that would mean their AGI could be at 63,333, and they would still qualify for a Pell Grant, a minimum Pell Grant at that. Okay, the other thing is that we have to remember is that a student can also qualify through a Pell Grant amount that's different from minimum Pell or maximum Pell through the fun SAI calculation that's going to be performed on the FAFSA. So really, when a student fills it out and the FAFSA is calculated, it looks at, do they automatically qualify for a minimum or maximum Pell? And if they don't, it does the SAI calculation. It's also going to be limited by the student's enrollment intensity, their cost of attendance, and their Pell lifetime limits. So those are all going to be affecting the Pell Grant amounts. Next slide, please. So now let's look at an independent student. So this would be a student who does not have to report parental information on that FAFSA. There are 3 different charts. The student is a single parent, so they're single and they have a child. The student is a parent, but not a single parent. And then the student is not a parent at all. The first thing, same steps, determine their state of legal residence. We'll probably all be using these charts because we're not in Alaska or Hawaii. We'll determine the marital status and then the maximum Pell for a single student. As long as they have a family size of 3, as long as they're at 51,818 for their AGI, then they will qualify for a minimum Pell Grant maximum Pell Grant. So they'll automatically get maximum Pell Grant. The second chart, if the student is married and a parent or they're in that household, this AGI needs to be less than or equal to 175% of the poverty guideline, which would be 40,303 for that family size of 3. And then the bottom chart, if the student is not a parent, that goes all the way up to 400%. Or sorry, I skipped down a slide. I apologize. The student is not a parent. That AGI has to be less than or equal to 175% of the poverty guideline, and their amount is $32,043. So they could still get a maximum Pell Grant in that case. So let's move to minimum Pell Grant. If the student is a single parent and their AGI for a family of 3 is at 92,120, because they're at 400% or less than 400% of the poverty guideline, then they'd qualify for a minimum Pell Grant. Look how high that AGI is. No one in this situation would get a Pell Grant this year with that high of an AGI. So it's really making some positive changes, I think. And then if the student is a parent and they're possibly married, if their AGI is less than or equal to 350% of the poverty guideline for a family of 3, that means they could get a minimum Pell Grant with an AGI of $80,605. And then if the student's not a parent and their AGI is less than or equal to 275% of the poverty guideline, if they had a family size of 2, their AGI could be at 50,353. So it's pretty cool. It's expanding Pell to more students. And the same thing applies. Pell Grant can be affected by how many hours they enroll in, the cost of their institution, and how much Pell Grant they've received in the past. All right. So this is very, very, very different, and we're going to have an adjustment period with this for sure. So Pell Grant is now going to be affected by enrollment intensity. So in short story, enrollment matters now. Matters how many hours you can enroll in. And I don't know how many times I've heard, I'm not full-time, I can't get financial aid. That is not correct. And you can see on this chart that is not correct. Students can possibly get a Pell Grant even if they're in 1 credit hour. So make sure you dispel that myth, take it with you, sing it atop the mountains, that students do not need to be full-time to get financial aid. We hear this so much from other college access professionals, people we work with, students, that myth kind of sticks. So they do not have to be full-time. So with minimum and maximum Pell Grant now, students are going to be awarded Pell based on those 3 things we talked about. Either they get the automatic Pell Grant based on those charts we just reviewed, they get the minimum Pell Grant, or an SAI calculation is performed if they don't qualify for the maximum Pell Grant. So the way that Pell is going to be determined is whatever the SAI is, Pell Grant is going to be based on the difference between the maximum Pell Grant and the student aid index. And if the calculation results in a Pell Grant amount award less than the minimum Pell amount, then the student won't be eligible for the Pell Grant based on the SAI. They still could potentially qualify for the minimum Pell Grant if they meet that criteria. And I've put a little example at the bottom for enrollment intensity as well. So Pell Grants are going to be affected by the student's enrollment. So this is a chart based on a credit hour school that is 12 credits or more is considered full-time. This is not the case for every school out there. For example, quarter hour or quarter schools are going to be a different chart. Clock hour schools are going to be a different chart. So this is for a school that considers 12 hours as full-time. So our example here is if the student is enrolled in 8 credit hours, and let's say our maximum Pell Grant is $73.95, which is not the actual amount. That's what it is for this year, and it will be different for next year. The student could receive 67% of that full-time Pell award. So they would still be able to get $4,955 at 8 credit hours of enrollment. So that is how it is going to work, and it's very different from what we're used to right now. So if students are adding and dropping classes, it really can affect their Pell Grant amounts. All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Leah for our closing us out, and I'll go back and answer some of the questions in the chat.
All right, so what sort of happens next? Let's take a look. So after a student and their contributors are done submitting their portions of the FAFSA form, they'll fully submit the form, and the student will then receive a FAFSA submission summary. This used to be called the Student Aid Report, so the SAR. This is now going to be called the FAFSA submission summary. Okay, so the student will be able to access this information online, and they can also print out a full version of this. And this FAFSA submission summary is broken down into 4 different sections. So the first section will be an eligibility overview. So it's basically going to outline estimates of potential aid that they're going to be eligible for, as well as show them the student aid index, or SAI, that was calculated from the form. So this is going to be really helpful because students will actually be able to see, okay, I can expect this amount in a Pell Grant. I can expect potentially this amount of loans and federal work studies. So it is good for them to know that this is an estimate, especially for those provisionally independent students who go through that process, because additional documentation could change things. But for the most part, they should be able to see these amounts and say, okay, yep, this is what I'm going to be eligible for through federal aid. The second section is going to be FAFSA form answers. So this is really going to outline all of the answers that the student and their contributors provided on the FAFSA. So this is also the section where if a student needs to make a correction, let's say that they fudged a number on accident, or they selected the wrong answer to something, they can go into this section of their FAFSA submission summary and start the correction process there. The third section is school information. So a student will be able to see all the colleges that they listed on their FAFSA form, and they will actually be able to compare these colleges to one another. So it's going to list like the graduation rates of each of those colleges, and a few other rates that we measure colleges off of. And it's also going to list like average debt, and they can add colleges by making a change to their FAFSA form. So that's going to be a great page for them to refer to if they're not quite sure which schools they sent their form to. And then the fourth section is next steps. So if you see in the screenshot there, there's a little red exclamation point next to the next steps section. And that red exclamation point is going to be there if there's anything that the student needs to read about, or any next steps that they need to take. So this next steps section will outline any informational comments that they should probably read through to know about what happens next with their FAFSA. And it will also outline any required steps that they need to make, such as making a correction if the FAFSA determines that something looks weird, or sending documentation to their college. So for example, when we were talking about the homeless youth determination, it would outline that their next step would be to submit documentation to their college for that status. So that is the FAFSA submission summary. So the next question, of course, is, okay, well, the FAFSA doesn't open until December. We don't have an official date yet. What can we do now to help students and families? So the number one thing that you can do now is to really focus on helping students and families set up their FSA IDs. So you can either run your own, or have, other presentations or events that are happening to create FSA IDs. You can provide resources. So there's a bunch of resources out there, videos and whatnot on how to take those steps. And you can incorporate that information into any financial aid nights that maybe your high schools or areas are having. So that's probably the biggest thing, is to get that process out of the way, because as Darcy mentioned earlier, it does take a couple of days for that information to match up with the Social Security Administration. And so the sooner that they can do that process, the better. The second thing that we would say you could do now is to emphasize scholarships. I can't say enough how important it is for especially your seniors right now in high school to be looking for scholarships starting now. And so we would really encourage students at this point in time to start looking for those scholarships, start figuring out when those application deadlines are. And so I would encourage you all to support students in starting that process now, since they don't have to spend the time filling out the FAFSA form right now. That's going to wait until December. So they've got a lot of extra time, right, to fill out those scholarship applications. So we would encourage them to look at any institutional applications at the colleges that they want to attend. the Kansas Board of Regents does have a state aid application that they can fill out to be considered for a variety of their scholarship opportunities, and then also any private scholarships that are out there. And we will have a session later on this year about scholarships and how that search process works and what those resources are. So check out our website if you have questions or want to register for that event. So number 3, we would encourage you all to start identifying students and families who have special or unusual circumstances right now. So if you know that you have a student or a family that has a change in a family's financial circumstances, or a student who can't contact their parents, or who is at risk of being homeless, or students whose parents are unwilling to provide that information on the FAFSA, we would encourage you to start identifying who those students are now, so that when they are going to fill out that form, they're aware that there are some new questions on there that they're going to need to answer, and some processes that they're going to want to go through with their office, with the financial aid office at the college they're looking at.
Real quick on that, Leah, I just wanted to interject. Schools are now required to follow up with any student identified with these unusual circumstances within 60 days of enrollment. So I know at least at my school, we are pulling lists of students who indicate that they weren't able to provide parent information on the FAFSA, or indicated they were homeless, and we do individual outreach with each of those students, and that will now be required from all schools.
Thank you, Danielle. So number 4, another thing you can address with your students now is helping them understand the costs of attending college. So assisting students in figuring out that cost information, not just for tuition and fees, but for all the other expenses that they're going to incur while they're in school. A lot of the time you can find that information on a college's website. And it's really important to help them sort of understand direct costs versus indirect costs. So yeah, they might have thought about tuition and fees. They might know what those rates are. They might have even thought about like living on campus and what that housing rate is, or how much that meal plan costs. But what are some of the other indirect costs that they're not thinking about, like how much their books might be a semester, or, how much money they're going to need per month to pay for stuff like toiletries or a pizza on a Friday night with their friends. So that is something that you can start having those conversations with your students on, and start directing them to resources around those pieces. And then number 5, we would just emphasize those priority dates and deadlines for the FAFSA and for scholarships that are happening at the colleges. Because even though we don't know when the FAFSA is going to open up yet, a lot of colleges already have their priority dates listed. And so we are in the process of updating those lists of FAFSA priority dates and deadlines on our KASFAA website. And so you can go out there and see the list. And once it's updated, all of those new dates will be there. So some resources that you guys could definitely kind of peruse if you want to learn more, or you're like, I'm not sure about some of those like Pell Grant calculations Danielle talked about earlier. How can I kind of work through some scenarios? There are lots of different resources and toolkits out there. So a really big one and helpful one for a lot of you is going to be NCAN's Better FAFSA website. So you'll see the link listed there. And so this website is kind of a living page at this moment of resources that are going to continue to be added as new information comes out about the new FAFSA. So they have a lot of really great scenarios that you can work through, some webinars that they've recorded, all sorts of things that might be helpful to you. NCAN also has future FAFSA training webinars that they are putting on throughout this fall. And so those training webinars are going over the new FAFSA line by line. They are going over what that FAFSA submission summary looks like, the FSA ID process for those without Social Security numbers. So if you are like, okay, I need to go through this type of training again, but I want to hear it in a different way, that would be a great webinar for you to either register for or watch the recording. You Aspire has resources out there that they are continuing to update. So very similar to NCAN, they're updating that information throughout this year when new information becomes available about the 24-25 FAFSA. And then, of course, Federal Student Aid or FSA, they have the Financial Aid Toolkit, which provides a variety of resources to use for situations in which you're sharing information with families and students. Maybe you're putting on presentations or you want to have a handout about a certain process. They have a lot of those types of tools and resources listed in the Financial Aid Toolkit. All right, so again, please emphasize FAFSA priority dates and deadlines to your students. A lot of schools will only consider students for limited funded funds if a student files by the FAFSA priority date. So we have some funds that we only have so much money to give out to students. And so if they don't file by that FAFSA priority date, they might not be considered for those funds at all. So like I said, we are updating these dates on our website. So in the next couple of days, we should have those new dates listed out there. But most two-year schools, from what we see, are moving their date to March or later for that FAFSA priority date. And then most four-year schools, from what we've seen, are moving that date to February or later. So just good to keep in mind that that date is kind of a little later this year. And then scholarship priority deadlines and dates are also listed out there on the website. And again, we're also updating these as well. But in the next couple of days, we should have that information there. And these vary they're all over the place for different institutions. So the earliest that we have seen listed at this point is December 1 for those scholarship deadlines. All right, and if we haven't mentioned it already a million times, we're going to mention it once more. So we do have a couple of other sessions coming up this year when it comes to FAFSA training and financial aid training. So our next session will be October 17th, and that will go over professional judgment and all the ins and outs of those processes. And then the session after that will be November 7th, which will go over the scholarship search process and resources on that. And then we are still determining dates, but some of our other topics that we will be covering are listed there. And we will share those dates on the KASFAA website when that becomes available. So we thank you guys for attending today. We do have a couple of questions still in the chat that we will address before we leave. But don't forget to submit your evaluations to us. We want to, get your feedback, especially for our next couple of sessions, so that we can answer those questions and address any future topics that you guys want to learn about. Thank you.
And I think we answered questions in the chat as we went, but please speak up if you have any questions at all. All right, presenters, do we want to stop the recording?
Yes, I can do that.